joining us for the Managing Challenges in the Criminal History Check Process webinar. In this, we'll take a look at challenges that may arise in the criminal history check process and strategies to resolve these challenges. We'll also share some tools that can help you navigate the process and ensure your program is compliant with criminal history check requirements. Criminal history checks are critical to protecting the beneficiaries of your program and ensuring your organization retains its grant funds. Failure to comply with the CNCS criminal history check may result in the loss of grant funds. All the tools I'm sharing today are samples and can be tailored to the needs of your program, and all tools are available for download in the virtual conference library under the Criminal History Checks tab and will be available on the Knowledge Network following the conference. I would like to cover our alternative search procedures. If a program cannot comply with the requirements of the corporation's criminal history check regulations, it may seek approval from the NCS to use an alternative search procedure, commonly referred to as an ASP. These can be used FBI checks or state checks. There are types of alternative search procedure requests that you can make. I too view the National Service Criminal History Check Resources homepage, which is on the right side of my screen, for a variety of resources concerning the criminal history check. Most importantly for our conversation right now is the Alternative Search Procedure Request form, which can be found midway down through the screen. This form is the one that you'll use to request to use an alternative search procedure or an example form together. There are some reasons you may need to have an alternative search procedure. And I have a flow chart here on the left side of the screen, which may be too small for you to read, but will be available afterwards. And find some of the challenges that you may encounter along the line here, and then it guides you through the appropriate actions. Some of the reasons you may need to request an alternative search procedure. I'm going to go through the form as they appear. The first reason you may need to request an alternative search procedure is to maintain alternative results of the check. The reason this might happen is if an alternative agency runs the checks and provides you as the grantee with only clearance letters rather than full reports of your volunteer's criminal history. Another want to request an alternative search procedure is to use a substantially equivalent process. One way to use a substantially equivalent process is if you, as a program, believe that your procedure is different but substantially equivalent to or better than the corporation's required procedures. This could be in the case of volunteer or staff that has previously been accepted by a CNCS-approved source. For example, if a Teach for America volunteer has a criminal history check run that meets CNCS's criminal history check requirements, and you'll be able to request to use that criminal history check that's already in existence. And you might request to use an alternative search procedure is the third box listed on this form, and it is to use a departmental order process for the FBI check. Departmental order process is essentially requesting permission to use pre-approved FBI vendors to an FBI check. One reason you might need to use one of these pre-approved FBI vendors is if your state repository doesn't run the FBI check as expected. List of all of the CNCS state repositories on the National Service Criminal History Check Resources page. You can also view the list of FBI-approved channelers by clicking on the link on the document on the left side of my screen, which, again, will be available following the presentation. Again, using the departmental orders process allows you to use pre-approved vendors or to obtain checks directly from the FBI rather than using your state CNCS designated repository. And then you would need to use the alternative search procedure request form on the right side of my screen is to request an exemption from the criminal history check requirements. So you may seek to do that are listed on the right side of my screen on the alternative search procedure request form. Exemptions may be requested for a variety of reasons, such as conflict with state law or an inability to cover the cost. Exemptions are requested, again, using the same form on the right side of my screen, but the resulting response from CNCS will not have the longevity of an ASP request of any of the types listed above. An exemption request will only last for 1 year and will need to be filed yearly after that original approval, whereas these alternative search procedures, once approved, multiple years. It's also a timeline for the ASP process. The search procedure process can be lengthy, potentially up to several months, due to the research that CNCS needs to complete to ensure the sufficient check is performed. It is a best practice to check in regularly, email or phone with CNCS to stay updated on the progress of your ASP request. While a decision regarding your ASP staff and/or volunteers can serve as long as they are accompanied by another volunteer or staff member that has already completed the criminal history check process. A comment can cease when results are received from the state check or the FBI check. However, it is important to note that if the volunteer or staff member does not ultimately pass the check, any funds used to compensate them for their time cannot be charged to CNCS. So alternative search procedure request can get a little bit tricky, so I wanted to also share some success stories with you about grantees in states that have successfully navigated this process. The tools and support you can expertly manage your ASP, and we're going to take a look at 2 states that have done so. The first example is in Massachusetts, where many grantees in the state encountered an issue when they found the designated state repository did not provide FBI checks. Therefore, many programs were out of compliance with the criminal history check rule. Grantees in this state raised the issue to their state office and to complete an exemption from the FBI check requirement. Documentation that the designated state repository didn't provide FBI checks as required by the ASP form. You can see on the right side of my screen what the appropriate documents attachments are for this form. The Massachusetts State Office coordinated with the Massachusetts Designated State Repository to help programs obtain a letter from that repository saying that they do not provide the FBI checks. Massachusetts programs submitted a letter and their request for exemption to the ASP email address as listed on the form, and the exemptions were approved by CNCS. Approval signaled that the requirement to conduct an FBI check could be waived for 1 year. Grantees must complete this exemption request yearly, including requesting an updated letter from the designated repository stating that it still doesn't provide those required FBI checks. So during this process, a representative at the state repository was designated to be the point of contact for programs moving forward, so that each year programs can contact this particular person to inquire if the repository would be able to provide the FBI checks, and if not, they would be able to obtain an updated letter that the repository still did not provide the check, so that programs could request this exemption yearly. The Massachusetts programs, the Massachusetts Massachusetts State Office in the repository has allowed Massachusetts grantees to complete the exemption process and ensure that their programs are compliant. Now, we have another example where the grantees in New Jersey were also unable to obtain FBI checks because the state repository does not provide FBI checks. The state repository in New Jersey does not provide a written that they do not provide the FBI check. Therefore, New Jersey grantees contacted the New Jersey State Office asking what to include in their request because the letter from the state repository, the letter of denial from the state repository was not available. So the New Jersey Office was able to work with agency's headquarters to determine that grantee Jersey should instead apply for an alternative search procedure in which grantees would require to use the departmental orders process for the FBI check. Headquarters accepted the ASPs with documentation of attempts to secure FBI checks, and based on this guidance, many New Jersey grantees were able to successfully submit ASPs and use those FBI-approved channels to conduct their checks. The next topic I want to cover is documentation of the criminal history check. It's critical that you are able to provide documentation, not only that all your volunteers and staff have been cleared, but also that you followed all of the necessary steps along the way. So then we'll start with the success story. The grantee in the Pennsylvania State Office that a sample checklist to ensure that they had addressed all of the required assurances and authorizations with regard to the criminal history check rule. The sample checklist on my screen, which will be available following the presentation in a Word document so that you can edit and update it to include your program information and additional information you may like to include. So the things to note that are included on this form are that this form authorizes the program to conduct the criminal history check on the volunteers. Note that the volunteers understand that selection into the program is contingent upon review of the criminal history checks. It notes that the volunteer understands that he or she will have an opportunity to review and challenge the results of the check. And it also notes that the volunteer understands that he or she must be accompanied by an authorized representative or to serve until the criminal history check is completed. This checklist that I'll scroll through a little bit more serves as a reminder that the criminal history check process goes beyond initiation of the check. It's really important to document assurances and authorizations as well. So again, here is the sample checklist. A couple of the items for. So one hard element is to document as a program manager that you have verified the identity of the applicant by examining their government-issued photo identification. So is by circling the document that was examined and an ID number, and then you should sign off that you have, in fact, verified the applicant's government-issued photo ID. Another important aspect of this assurances and authorizations form is this item right here, where the volunteer authorizes the program to conduct the appropriate checks. That the volunteer sharing of the results with the program. The next element is that the volunteer should authorize that they understand that selection into the program is contingent upon the program's review of their criminal history checks. The volunteer should also affirm that they know that they will have reasonable opportunity to review and challenge the accuracy of a result before action is taken to exclude them from the program. And lastly, we want the volunteer to understand and acknowledge that while the results of the criminal history checks are pending, they are not permitted to have access to vulnerable populations defined as children, people age 16 over, and individuals with disabilities. And if they do have access to vulnerable populations, they need to be accompanied by an authorized representative who has been previously cleared for such access. This form was really created and intended for you all to use in your volunteer intake process to get signatures and then to note the process of each of the checks. So murder self-certification, NSOPW, you should record the results of on the day that they are run. It's important to note the date that state check and FBI check were initiated, as well as the date that the results were received. It's also beneficial to make time to review the results of the criminal history check with volunteers. And it's important for you to note that you have considered the results of the criminal history check when selecting the individual to serve. On the page of this document, you can find a flowchart that is a guide for determining which checks volunteers will need. And so you can go through each step and answer yes or no, and end up in the appropriate check. So hope this is a good tool for you as you process new volunteers and catch up on documentation for existing volunteers. So one item that I touched on only briefly is, but it is an important part of documentation. It deals with pending state or FBI checks who are in contact with a vulnerable population must be physically accompanied at all times by someone who's been cleared for such access. It is not only important to perform accompaniment, it is also important to document accompaniment. So we're to include in writing who accompanied a volunteer while their check was pending, on what dates, during what hours, and have the individual who performed accompaniment incrementally sign off attesting to the accuracy of the documentation. One way to do this is to add it to your existing volunteer timesheet. You should have policies and procedures clearly describing your accompaniment guidelines and documentation procedures. The next item I'm going to cover is what to do when the background check reveals previous offenses. Find that the two offenses that disqualify volunteers from serving, according to CNCS, are if the person is listed on the National Sex Offender Public website or if they've been convicted of murder. That if you wish to set your standards higher, these standards should be provided in writing to the volunteer and in agency policy. For example, if your volunteers will be responsible for driving in your program, you may decide to add a DUI as a disqualifying standard. Beyond any additions you make, you need to make sure that the standards of clearance minimally meet CNCS requirements, and before you begin the check, it's best practice to share your policies and procedures with the volunteers so they know the criteria they're going to be evaluated against. Submit a criminal history check to your state repository or perhaps the FBI-approved channeler or directly to the FBI itself. The source will typically present results in one of two ways. The first way, they could present a document noting that the person checked either passed or failed the check. So sources that provide a pass-fail determination, you agree to their standards of clearance. And if you're using a CNCS state repository or approved FBI channeler, you are going to have the correct standards of clearance. So you agree to their standards of clearance when you agree to using the source to run your check. And the second way that you might receive results from state repository or otherwise approved source is that they may provide you a full list of the individual's record. And in this case, the source will not make a determination about the eligibility of the volunteer to serve. Instead, you will be responsible for interpreting the list of arrests and convictions and determining if the volunteer is eligible. Determination of eligibility needs to be based on your documented clearance policy. All volunteers are evaluated fairly and consistently. For instance, if you receive check results that include a DUI, you can't use that conviction as reason to disqualify a volunteer unless you have that offense listed as a disqualifying offense in your clearance policy. Additionally, you cannot disqualify a volunteer based on pending charges. And if you volunteers with pending charges, you should periodically check on resolution of these pending charges. Please note that only a conviction can warrant disqualification. Convictions may include vague terminology that's difficult to understand. So to determine if the list includes a disqualifying offense according to your program's clearance policy, you'll make sure you fully understand the terms that are used. You might consider reaching out to your local police department to get clarity if needed. Volunteers, you'll need to refer to your program's clearance policy to determine if the results warrant exclusion from service. Be careful to tailor your inquiries about the volunteer's personal history so that they can be as specific as possible. A question as vague and broad as, do you have a record, may be as helpful as you think. The volunteer may not know what's included in their record, how many years it goes back, and they may provide you an answer that intend to give false statement. So ask really specific questions of your volunteers. This topic that I would like to cover is a frequent question, which is, what should I do if fingerprints can't be read? This happens fairly regularly when fingerprinting senior volunteers. And so importantly, your program should document its efforts to obtain the fingerprints. For instance, the date you took the fingerprints, the organization that was used, and in documentation from the facility stating that the fingerprints were unreadable. The repository will have a protocol to validate identification and perform a name-based FBI check after several failed fingerprint attempts. The project needs to, you as a program manager, need to work with the repository to use such a protocol and then document the process and results. Able to use the state repository system, and there are no FBI sanctioned methods for obtaining a name-based FBI check in lieu of fingerprints. So now I have a handful of the challenges when now history check process and the questions that have been posed. Criminal history checks are a critical part of keeping our beneficiaries safe and ensuring that your program retains your grant funding. Free to review these materials following the presentation. They will be available for use on the Knowledge Network. So thanks again for your time.